For decades, private for-profit colleges have enjoyed booming enrollment and annual profits that climbed into the billions of dollars. While some private for-profit colleges are innovative and have helped increase the number of college graduates, some have offered low-quality education at a very high cost. In 2009, the California legislature established a new regulatory structure to monitor the quality and business practices of private for-profit colleges. As part of the 2009 legislation, the state's Legislative Analyst Office was asked to engage in an evaluation of the new regulations and determine whether they needed to be changed or modified in some way. Recently, the Legislative Analyst reported its findings. What were their recommendations and how will the legislature respond? We'll ask Judy Heiman from the nonpartisan LAO who wrote the report, and Laura Metune, former chief of the Bureau of Private and Postsecondary Education and current consultant to the California Assembly Higher Education Committee. Private for-profit universities, protecting students' and taxpayers' interests.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
About 11% of all California college students are enrolled in private for-profit colleges, and the number is growing, adding to a concern about whether there is proper oversight on what they do and how they do it. Our guest is Judy Heiman from the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, who wrote a recent report on the oversight of private colleges in California. Welcome to the Maddy Report, Judy.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So what are the main types of private post-secondary schools and what do they do?
Well, there are two main types, nonprofit and for-profit institutions. Nonprofit colleges, like many public colleges, tend to offer a pretty broad range of degree programs in liberal arts and sciences, technical fields, professional fields, and
think Stanford, University of the Pacific, schools like that. Okay.
Exactly. Nonprofits are typically founded by charitable or religious organizations, and they're accountable to a volunteer board of directors, and the members of those boards are prohibited by law from benefiting financially from the institutions. For-profit colleges, on the other hand, tend to offer a narrower range of programs, not always, but typically focus on vocational areas. But there's quite a variety. Think anywhere from the University of Phoenix to Citrus Heights Beauty College near Sacramento here. For-profits may be owned by individuals or families or by shareholders of public corporations or other investors. Now, public corporations have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. That means they're required by law, they're accountable by law for the profits they provide for their owners, and that's an important difference between for-profits and nonprofits.
So what are the concerns regarding for-profit colleges?
Well, some of the concerns have to do with the intense business pressures that for-profits face regarding profits and how those might adversely affect students. Investigations of for-profits suggest that some of them are offering low-quality programs at a very high cost to students and taxpayers. For example, a Senate investigation found that for-profits account for about 10 to 13% of students, about 25% of federal student financial aid, and nearly half of all defaults on student loans.
So very heavy on the default area. What's the current regulatory scheme then for for-profit colleges?
Well, there are three independently acting entities that oversee private colleges, well, actually oversee all colleges in the United States. The federal government, accrediting bodies, and state agencies, and that's called the regulatory triad. It's designed to ensure that post-secondary schools serve the interests of taxpayers as well as students. Each part of the triad has a different role. The federal government sets the rules for which institutions can participate in federal aid programs. Accreditors verify that institutions meet acceptable educational quality standards, and the state's role is really one of consumer protection or student protection.
You know, you said in your report, you were talking about two divergent regulatory philosophies. What are they?
Right. So one approach really focuses on student protection through standards, and the other one focuses on disclosure of costs and benefits. So under the first approach, schools that don't meet those standards aren't allowed to operate. Under the second approach, schools have much more latitude to operate as long as they disclose the costs and benefits and allow students to make better informed decisions.
You know, in 2009, California established a new regulatory structure to oversee these private colleges. Why was the new law passed?
Well, California has a long history of struggling to figure out how best to oversee private colleges. And a regulatory structure that we had in place starting in 1989 proved to be very cumbersome and ineffective. So that was allowed to sunset in in 2007. And for 2 years, the state had no authority to oversee private schools. Some people
so
call
no
this
regulation.
No regulation.
Wild, wild west.
The dark period. And during that time, several schools started offering programs in California to take advantage of the regulatory vacuum. So then in 2009, the state passed the Private Postsecondary Education Act, and it had 3 goals: to ensure that private schools meet minimum quality standards, to ensure meaningful student protections and appropriate level of oversight institutions, and also to protect the public from being deceived by fraudulent degrees.
So we've got a state bureau now, a Bureau of Private Postsecondary Education. What does it do?
Well, it has 3 major functions that go along with the 3 goals of the law.
Okay.
So it licenses programs that meet the minimum standards, it resolves student complaints, and then it enforces business practice.
So then what are the national and regional accrediting agencies? What are they doing?
They're primarily responsible for overseeing educational quality at the institutions. And as you mentioned, there are 2 main types, regional and national. All public institutions and most degree-granting nonprofit institutions are regionally accredited by one of 6 accreditors, 6 regional associations that are recognized by the federal government. The one we have locally is the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, or WASC.
WASC, and we
Right.
hear that a lot about that.
Right.
Well, up next, we're going to talk about how you improve the oversight of private for-profit colleges. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Judy Heiman from the Legislative Analyst Office about the oversight of for-profit colleges. So we've got different types of oversight. One is done by accreditors. Where do they do a better job?
Well, we looked at both their standards and how they enforce their standards, and compared how accreditors do that with how the Bureau for Private Postsecondary Education does that. And
We'll
generally,
just call it the Bureau for short.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. Generally, what we found is that accreditors provide better oversight of educational program quality, and that makes sense, right? Because that's their role in the regulatory triad. They provide more comprehensive review of educational programs, and
so they may have a team come in and really take a look at the curriculum and things of that nature.
Exactly.
Okay. And they also, I think I read in your report that they're also pretty good at general operations. What do you mean by what is general operations?
Oh, that includes a number of things such as required financial ratios, facility requirements, record-keeping requirements. And in those areas we found that there are a lot of similarities between the Bureau's standards and accreditors'
So you might as well have the accreditors do it, since why duplicate
Exactly.
what's already being done. But you did say the Bureau was good on a few things. You talked about business practices and student complaints. What are those specifically, and why are they better?
Sure. Business practices, we're talking about, for example, advertising and recruitment and tuition policies and refund and cancellation policies.
It's almost like consumer protection.
It's exactly what it is, as well as disclosure of information to allow students to make informed decisions. And that is the traditional area for states in the regulatory triad, and that's where the Bureau really excels and does better than accreditors.
You also mentioned they're better at student complaints. Why?
Well, one of the Bureau's
handling student complaints.
One of the Bureau's main jobs is to resolve individual student complaints. So if a complaint comes in, they establish the facts, they investigate that complaint, and then they can order restitution or refunds or any appropriate action. Accreditors also accept complaints, but they pass them on to the institutions and expect the institutions to resolve them. They might look for patterns of complaints that tell you about underlying problems, but it's not their job to pursue an individual complaint on behalf of a student. The Bureau does.
It seems like accreditors are more focused on the kind of the quality of the educational experience, and the Bureau is more focused on kind of consumer protection aspects of the experience.
That's right.
You know, the U.S. Department of Education made some changes that resulted in improvements in business practices and dealing with student complaints. So, do we need Bureau oversight if the U.S. Department of Education is already handling it?
Well, they did tighten their standards a little bit. For example, they prohibited incentive-based payments for recruiting and enrolling students, and that helps. But part of the way that they tighten their standards is by requiring more of the states. For example, they're requiring that all institutions, in order to qualify for federal aid, be explicitly approved by a state and have a state complaint resolution process. So part of how the feds are tightening up is to rely more on the states.
And pass it on. But it's pretty important inducement, because if those colleges want students to be able to take out these federal financial aid packages, they have to have approval by the state. But that also puts more pressure on the state in terms of maybe the personnel, the staffing they need to do their job. Wouldn't that also be the case?
Right. So in looking at all this, we made some recommendations about how the Bureau could best target its resources to where it provides the most value.
Where do you think it should be targeted?
In general, we think that it makes sense, like I said, for the Bureau to focus on the places where it adds value and it's not duplicating the work of accreditors. So that primarily means focusing on business practices, but it might help to take it one group of schools at a time. So for regionally accredited schools, they're currently exempt from Bureau oversight. And for the most part, we think that makes sense. We don't think it's necessary for the Bureau to be looking at their educational quality or their general operating practices, and for the most part also their business practices, because there haven't been problems with most of them. There's a small subset of these institutions, however, that we do have concerns about and where problems have emerged. And so for that subset of institutions, we think it makes sense for the Bureau to oversee their business practices and student complaints.
Okay, so what you're saying, the way I understand it, is the Bureau may not need more staff, it needs more focus on business practices and student complaints specifically.
Right.
Okay, what do you think about the whole issue of online instruction? That's becoming a big area now. Is that regulated? Is it regulated well? Is it regulated at all?
In California, online schools that don't have a physical presence in the state, no bricks and mortar here in the state, are not subject to Bureau oversight. So they are not regulated, even if they're serving students here in California. New federal rules will probably require that all institutions have approval from every state where they serve students. And many states require that if a school is serving students in their state, even if they're not located there, they'd be approved.
So could you use Cal grants for online instruction payments, possibly?
Cal Grants also requires a physical presence in the state.
They do require physical presence,
Yes.
so we don't have to worry about state money
Right.
being spent on out-of-state
Right.
programs that aren't regulated.
But there's some potential solutions here. A number of states are working together and regions to develop a state authorization reciprocity agreement whereby they can recognize each other's approval of institutions based on common agreed-upon standards, so that they'll know that institutions have appropriate oversight.
So each online program doesn't have to be approved 50 times.
Exactly,
It can be approved once.
exactly.
Well, I want to thank Judy Heiman from the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office for joining us. Up next, what is the legislative response to the LEO report? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. The LEO has recommended that the legislature make some changes in how private for-profit colleges are regulated. So what's been the legislative response? Our guest is Laura Metune, former chief of the Bureau of Private and Postsecondary Education, that's a mouthful, and consultant with the California Assembly for Higher Education Committee. So welcome to the Maddy Report, Laura.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we've heard that the LEO thinks that there ought to be a division of oversight between the Bureau, which you used to lead, and accrediting agencies, and that the state agency, the Bureau, should cede its oversight in areas of educational quality and general operations. What's happening in the legislature in response?
The LEO report actually comes out of a requirement in the law that created the Bureau to report on the exemptions contained in the law. Under the existing statutory structure, some accredited institutions are governed by the Bureau and others are not. And the question to the LAO was whether or not those that are not governed by the Bureau should be. The LAO came back and said yes, in some areas they should be governed by the Bureau. The legislature generally has agreed with that perspective. In fact, in the accredited institutions that we do govern, we already created an expedited pathway for approval. So if a school is nationally accredited, it's given an approval by means of accreditation, which really just means that the Bureau looks at the accreditation documents and grants approval. I think what the LAO is recommending is something very similar for regionally accredited institutions.
Okay, so you've got some exempt institutions. The LAO recommends that for those exempt institutions, the Bureau look at two things: business practices and student complaints. And that seems to be, you know, when you talk about private for-profit colleges, that's sometimes where people are concerned. What is the legislature doing in that regard?
I think what the legislature has to look at is what we expect the Bureau to be able to do when a student complains. If we exempt an institution from everything but a student complaint, does that just mean that the student can file a complaint with the Bureau? If there's no set of law by which the institution is bound, what is the Bureau going to do to evaluate whether or not the student's entitled to some sort of remedy? I think that's the debate that the legislature will be having.
You know, the LEO is also saying that the Bureau should target its business review to select schools. Is there anything being discussed in the legislature about that?
We've had ongoing debates about what constitutes a good school and what constitutes a bad school, and I really don't think that we've come to a determination. The closest thing we did was a couple of years ago. We changed Cal Grant requirements so that an institution could have no more than a certain percentage of their students defaulting on their loans within 3 years after beginning repayment of that loan. And institutions that have too many students defaulting on their loans were no longer eligible for the Cal Grant program.
So you're looking at some metrics, some objective measure. Besides defaulting on Cal Grants, could you look at employment rates of graduates? Is that unfair, but given the economy, it's really not the school's fault because the economy is not?
So the way Assembly Bill 48, which created the Bureau, handled this was to not necessarily set thresholds, but to require students to be informed. Students were required to be told what the expected salary they might receive upon graduation or how many students were graduating. I think the next question we'll be asking ourselves in the legislature is, should we set some thresholds and should we expect schools to be moving in a certain direction in order to maintain their approval?
Is there any thought on that question, now that you've raised it?
I think that this is a big debate in the legislature. You don't want to create a structure that means that students are not being enrolled in institutions. Maybe institutions decide you're too much of an at-risk student and we're not going to give you this opportunity because we have to meet these thresholds. So it's really a balance.
You know, there's also, it's not just the Bureau and all these accrediting national and regional accrediting agencies. There's also a myriad of other agencies that play a role in for-profit private colleges. There's the Department of Consumer Affairs, there's the California Student Aid Commission, there's the California Department of Veteran Affairs. What areas have been identified for improving interagency cooperation and trying to avoid the kind of duplication of regulation?
I actually think the Bureau is going in the right direction on that. What they've essentially done is said that if there's another licensing agency that reviews a program, the educational program, the Bureau will cede authority to that agency. Essentially, the Bureau will look at the student disclosures, the business practices, but when it comes to that specific program, say nursing, a simple letter from the Board of Registered Nursing saying that this program has been reviewed and approved will suffice for educational review by the Bureau.
So stop the duplication, you have one place to go to. You know, there's a whole other area that's out there, and that's online education and online colleges. You see these commercials all the time on TV. What's the legislature doing to regulate online colleges teaching California students and taking California money?
In 2009, when we debated this topic, we decided to eliminate institutions from the Bureau's scope that did not have a physical presence in the state of California. That was for a couple of reasons. One was, what authority does the Bureau really have when trying to take an action against an institution located out of the state or out of the country? And then secondly, how much work is that for the Bureau? If they really can't take an action, are we creating an unmanageable workload? But now that online is really expanded, I think we're having to reevaluate that question. Certainly that will be an area of debate for the legislature.
It may be that you're going to say regulation is needed and we're going to have to increase the number of people in the Bureau to handle that
Certainly a student can't be expected to know whether or not the institution has a physical presence in California when they're enrolling online.
Yeah.
And our priority is going to be protecting students.
Okay, well, up next, is there enough oversight of private for-profit colleges to ensure that the students and the state money isn't being wasted on useless degrees from diploma mills? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Laura Metune, former chief of the Bureau of Private and Postsecondary Education, again, that's a mouthful, and consultant to the California Assembly Higher Education Committee on the oversight of private for-profit colleges. One of the criticisms of for-profit private colleges is that there are some out there that are offering fraudulent or substandard degrees. Is there any additional regulation or oversight being considered to shut down some of these diploma mills, or do we have sufficient laws and regulations to deal with that problem?
The term diploma mill generally applies to an institution that's truly selling a degree. And I absolutely believe that California's laws are strong enough to prevent that from happening. The question is whether or not we have a strong enough law to ensure quality of education. I think that's still being debated. The Bureau's only been in existence since 2010, and I'm not sure that we've had enough time to determine whether or not the existing laws are strong enough.
Yeah, and the quality, what is a good education is difficult concept to define.
We haven't quite figured that out in our public sector, let alone the private sector.
Exactly. What about those private colleges that are providing technical training or vocational certificate programs? Are those regulated?
They are regulated by the Bureau. There's some additional exemptions provided in the law. One of them is for institutions offering programs under $2,500. So if you're a small school offering a small program, you might be exempt from the law. But otherwise, they are covered by the Bureau.
Okay. What about, we talked about the Cal Grant program. And so that's state money that's going out to pay for the education of California students at some of these schools. Is enough being done to make sure that the Cal Grant money isn't being spent on these diploma mills or degree mills?
As I mentioned, the actions we took a few years ago did set some clear outcome thresholds for institutions that participate in Cal Grant.
Can you give an example of that? I mean, what kinds of things they look at when they're trying to make a determination, hey, is this a good degree or not?
So they look at whether or not the institution's accredited. And then they look at whether or not the institution has a cohort default rate above the set threshold.
Okay, cohort default rate. Okay, just define that.
Sure. Essentially what that means is how many students are entering into default on their federal loans within 3 years after entering repayment.
Okay, that's a red flag.
Yes.
Okay, and so there is some regulation, even in the vocational and technical programs and Cal Grant programs. I'm sorry.
I was just going to continue that the federal government in 2010 said to states that they needed to have a state approval process in order for an institution to participate in federal financial aid programs. So the Bureau's approval process is that pathway. Now, whether or not we want to establish some similar default rate thresholds or graduation rate thresholds for those schools approved by the Bureau is going to make a difference in whether or not they can participate in federal aid programs.
Yeah, so these for-profit private schools, they want to be approved because they can get the federal money and state money then. So
Correct.
That's pretty important to them. So that's an incentive, certainly. Another way to regulate. What do you think in terms of oversight in this area? Do you think more oversight or any additional areas of oversight should be considered?
This is what we're going to debate in the coming year. The Bureau is coming up for sunset, and the legislature will be reviewing it in this coming year, whether or not the existing...
When does it sunset?
It sunsets at the end of December.
Okay, and so they're going to be considering whether or not they should continue this.
Exactly.
Any thoughts on where it's trending?
I think there's a lot of areas that we can question, and the LAO report highlights whether or not we can eliminate some areas of oversight and rely on accreditors, and maybe add some areas of oversight when it comes to protecting students.
There are some very good private for-profit programs out there, colleges out there, and there's tremendous demand for college students. So whether we get them through the UCs or the Cal States or private for-profit or private nonprofit, we need more college graduates. So what's being done to make sure that the good for-profit private colleges are getting timely approval of their programs?
So the Bureau's approval by means of accreditation process essentially means that a school that's already accredited gets an expedited approval when seeking approval in the state of California. The challenge, I think, is for those institutions, new institutions. In order to become accredited, you have to first have state approval. And in order to get state approval, if you're unaccredited, it's a very lengthy process. As you can imagine, most schools come to the Bureau and say they have every intention of being the next most innovative institution and meeting accreditation standards, but the Bureau doesn't necessarily know when they're just looking at the application. So I think the challenge to the Bureau is to ensure they have the staffing levels sufficient to do a thorough but quick review of new applications.
How big is the staffing level at the Bureau?
It's about 60.
60 people to cover all of the
Yes.
private colleges in California. Okay, well, it seems like a lot of work. What's being done to make sure that private for-profit colleges fit into the state's goals of more access, affordability, and student success? This
has actually been an area that we're challenged with in California right now. The state doesn't currently have an oversight entity that reviews higher education standards and expectations. And with the absence of that, there's not really somebody who coordinates between our public segments and our private segments. Community colleges and our California State Universities and University of California, their chancellor's offices and the Office of the President all work very closely together, but they don't necessarily incorporate the for-profit colleges.
Should they?
I think that there are many good colleges, as you mentioned, that are helping meet our state's needs, and we do need to figure out how well that can meet the economic needs of the state, how much they can contribute. There is a bill right now, Assembly Bill 1348 by Speaker Perez, that would reestablish a state coordinating body for higher education. And the goal of that is to really bring all of these segments together.
We'll have to watch what happens there. Well, I want to thank Laura Metune, the former chief of the Bureau of Private and Postsecondary Education, a consultant to the California Assembly Higher Education Committee, as well as Judy Heiman from the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office for joining us. If you want to stay current with Valley politics and policy, you can log on to our website and look at the Maddy Daily, which is free of charge, at maddyinstitute.org.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.